The two criminal personalities, mutually linked together by elective affinities, each create a concentrationary universe with great similarities between them. This is how the construction of the omnipresent political myth of our time proceeds. In truth, despite inaugurating this tradition, Arendt elaborated a more complex discourse. At one end, she mentions, although very briefly, the totalitarian methods of liberal Britain's concentration camps where the Boers are confined, but also the totalitarian aspects present in the concentration camps that France's Third Republic established after the Spanish Civil War. On the other hand, in making the comparison between Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Germany, Arendt points out some important distinctions. Only in the second case does she speak of extermination camps. There's more. In the USSR the guards were not like the SS, a type of elite force trained to commit crimes, as is confirmed by the analysis from a witness who passed through the tragic experience of both concentrationary universes. The Russians never showed the sadism of the Nazis. Our Russian guards were good people and not sadists, but they scrupulously followed the rules of that inhuman system. 602 In our time, however, the references to the liberal West, and the mere mention of different kinds of concentrationary universes in which the liberal West was implicated, have now disappeared. The entire discourse centers on the similarity between the Gulag and the Konzentrationslager. For such a comparison to be persuasive, they must first inflate the numbers of the Stalinian terror. Recently, an American researcher calculated that the executions that actually took place reached a tenth of the usual estimates. 603 It's clear, obviously, that the horror of that repression is always on a large scale. However, the audacity of certain historians and ideologues is significant. Nor do they limit themselves to inflating the numbers. In a political and historical void, the construction of the monstrous twins can take it a step further. The Holocaust carried out by Nazi Germany against the Jews, especially starting from the stalemate on the Eastern Front, corresponds to the earlier Holocaust. In this second case it was a matter of a planned terror famine that ended up becoming an immense Bergen-Belsen, that's to say an immense extermination camp. 604 It was Robert Conquest who particularly distinguished himself in spreading this thesis. His critics accuse him of having worked as a disinformation agent for British intelligence services, and of having studied the Ukrainian case through the perspective of that profession. 605 Even his admirers recognize a point that doesn't diminish in importance. Conquest is a veteran of the Cold War and wrote his book in the context of a political-cultural operation that was ultimately led by U.S. President Ronald Reagan and which achieved numerous successes. On the one hand, significantly putting into the focus of international debate the value and limits of Gorbachev's reforms, and on the other hand, it powerfully influenced the radicalization of separatist ambitions in Ukraine. 606 In other words, the book was published in the atmosphere of a political-cultural operation that aimed to deliver the final and decisive blow to the Soviet Union, exposing it as responsible for shameful acts completely identical to those committed by the Third Reich, and encouraging its disintegration by making a people victimized in a Holocaust become aware of it, thus making coexistence with their tormentors impossible. It's necessary not to lose sight of the fact that, in the same period, together with a book on Ukraine, Conquest published another, in which he gives advice to his fellow citizens about how to survive a possible invasion by the Soviet Union. 607 Of course, regardless of the underlying political motivations, a thesis must be analyzed based on the arguments it offers. And the thesis of the terror famine planned by Stalin to exterminate the Ukrainian people may prove to be more credible than the thesis that Reagan's United States ran the risk of being invaded by Gorbachev's USSR. Therefore, let's concentrate our attention on Ukraine in the first years of the 1930s. In 1934, upon returning from a trip to the Soviet Union that had also taken him to Ukraine, the French Prime Minister, Edouard Herriot, denies not only its planned character, but also the extent and seriousness of the famine. 608 These declarations, made by a leader of a country that in the following year would sign an alliance treaty with the USSR, are generally considered unreliable. However, the testimony contained in the diplomatic reports by Fascist Italy are beyond suspicion. Even in the period in which the repression of counter-revolutionaries is at its cruelest, it is combined with initiatives that go in a different and opposite direction. The soldiers are sent to the rural areas to collaborate in the work in the fields, and workers come to repair farming equipment, together with the effort to destroy any hint of Ukrainian separatism. We witness a policy of promoting the Ukrainian national character which seeks to attract the Ukrainians of Poland for a possible and sought-after union with the USSR, and this objective is pursued by favoring the free expression of the Ukrainian language, culture and tradition. 609 Did Stalin seek to attract the Ukrainians of Poland into uniting with Soviet Ukrainians by exterminating the latter through starvation? From what we can tell, soon after the start of World War II, the Soviet troops who stormed into the Ukrainian territory until that moment occupied by Poland were warmly welcomed by the local population. 610 Now let's see the image that arises from the statements by Stalin's other enemies, this time from within the communist movement. Trotsky was born in Ukraine, and who in the last years of his life repeatedly addressed the subject of his homeland, taking a position in favor of the pro-independence movement. He condemns the ferocity of the repression but, despite not sparing Stalin of accusations, he makes no mentions of the so-called Holocaust of hunger organized from Moscow. 611 Trotsky stresses that the Ukrainian masses are driven by an irreconcilable hostility toward the Soviet bureaucracy, but identifies the reason for such hostility in the repression of Ukrainian independence. Judging by this thesis popular nowadays, the Holodomor had taken place at the start of the 1930s. However, according to Trotsky, the Ukrainian problem has intensified at the start of this year, that's to say 1939.612. Like Stalin, the leader of the anti-Stalinist opposition also wanted to unify all Ukrainians, although this time not within the USSR, but rather in an independent state. Would it have made sense to formulate that project while remaining totally silent on the genocide that had already taken place? In Trotsky's opinion, the treachery of the Soviet bureaucracy consists of this: it erected monuments to the great national poet, Taras Shevchenko, but only to force the Ukrainian people to pay homage to their Muscovite oppressors in the language of their national poet. 613 As one can see, he does not speak of genocide, nor even ethnocide, for however strong the condemnation of the Stalinian regime may be, he doesn't accuse it of either the physical or cultural destruction of the Ukrainian people. Whether inside or outside the communist movement, the enemies of Stalin converge on this essential acknowledgement. The fragility and the instrumentalization of the analogy between the Holodomor and the final solution is starting to become clear. Hitler and other Nazi leaders explicitly and repeatedly proclaim that it's necessary to proceed toward the annihilation of the Jews, compared to a bacteria, a virus, a pathogenic agent, whose extermination would allow for society to become healthy again. It would be useless to search for similar declarations by Soviet leaders with regards to the Ukrainian people. It could be more interesting to compare the policy of Stalin's USSR and Hitler's Germany in relation, in both cases, to Ukraine. Hitler proclaimed on various occasions that Ukrainians, like all subjugated peoples, must be kept at the proper distance away from culture and education. It's necessary to also destroy their historical memory. It would be good if they didn't even know how to read and write. 614 And that's not all. One could do well without 80% to 90% of the local population. 615 Above all else, one could totally do well without the intellectual classes. Their liquidation is the condition for transforming the subjugated people into a hereditary caste of slaves or semi-slaves, destined to work and die in service to the master race. The Nazi program is later clarified by Himmler. It's a matter of immediately eliminating the Jews and to reduce to a minimum the total Ukrainian population to clear the way for the future German colonization. That is how, the historian cited here comments, in Ukraine as well the construction of the Nazi Empire and the Holocaust go hand in hand, and in it those very same Ukrainian nationalists take part, and they constitute the principal sources for Conquest's book and will later act as his principal propagandists. 616 Relative to the Third Reich, Soviet power moves in the precise opposite direction. We learned of the affirmative action policy, promoted by Soviet power in relation to national minorities and Ukrainian brothers and comrades, to take the words used by Stalin soon after the October Revolution. 617 In effect, who most decisively promotes affirmative action in favor of the Ukrainian people is precisely that figure who today is considered responsible for the Holodomor. In 1921 he rejects the notion of those for whom the Ukrainian Republic and the Ukrainian nation were an invention of the Germans. No, it's evident that the Ukrainian nation exists and that communists should develop its culture. 618 Starting from that basis, they carry out the Ukrainization of culture, schools, the press, publishers, party cadre and the state apparatus. Lazar Kaganovich, who is a loyal associate to Stalin, and who in March of 1925 becomes party secretary in Ukraine, gives particular attention to that policy. 619 The results don't take very long. In 1931 the publication of books in Ukrainian reaches its peak of 6,218 out of 8,086 titles, nearly 77%, while the percentage of Russians in the party, around 72% in 1922, had been reduced to 52%. It's also necessary to have in mind the development of the Ukrainian industrial apparatus, Stalin again insisting on its importance. 621 can seek to minimize all of this, referring to the persistent monopoly on power exercised in Moscow by the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. However, that policy of Ukrainization has such a strong impact that it is forced to confront resistance from Russians. The former in any case were disillusioned with the solution given to the national question in the USSR. The equalization of Russia with the other federal republics shocked them, the rights extended to minorities within the Russian Republic irritated them, the anti-Russian rhetoric of the regime angered them, and it weighed upon them the fact that Russians were the only nationality of the Federation that didn't have a party of their own, nor a science academy of their own. 621 Not only does it not make sense to compare the Soviet policies to that of the Nazis, but the first, in fact, proves to be fully superior to that of the whites. Conquest himself ends up recognizing this against his will. Placing himself on a line of continuity in relation to Tsarist autocracy, Denikin refused to admit the existence of Ukrainians. Precisely the opposite attitude of Stalin, who praises the Ukrainization of Ukrainian cities. After the success of this policy a new and especially positive page has been turned. In April of 1923, at the 12th Congress of the party, the policy of Ukrainization obtained full legal recognition. For the first time since the 19th century, a stable Ukrainian government included in its program the defense and development of the Ukrainian language and culture. The Ukrainian cultural figures who returned to their country did it with the real hope that a Soviet Ukraine could also give life to its national rebirth. And in large part, for some years, they were right. Poetry and prose, linguistic and historical works had a wide and intense circulation among all classes, while all past literature was reprinted on a large scale. 622 We have seen that this policy is in force, and even in full development, in Ukraine at the start of the 1930s. Of course, soon a terrible conflict and famine will follow, however, It remains a mystery how over such a short period of time it can switch from radical affirmative action in favor of Ukrainians to planning their extermination. It's good not to forget that Ukrainian nationalist circles played an important role in the elaboration and promotion of the Holodomor thesis, after having carried out many pogroms against Jews during the years of the Civil War. 623 oftentimes collaborating with the Nazi invaders, immersed in the realization of the final solution. After having simultaneously functioned as an instrument of demonization and of convenient self-absolution, the Holodomor thesis becomes a formidable ideological weapon in the final period of the Cold War and in the program for the Soviet Union's dismemberment. A last consideration. During the 20th century, the genocide accusation and Holocaust denunciation were utilized in the most different ways. We've already seen a number of examples. One more should be added. On October 20, 1941, the Chicago Tribune reports the passionate appeal led by Herbert Hoover for an end to the blockade imposed by Great Britain on Germany. A few months earlier, the war of extermination was unleashed by the Third Reich against the Soviet Union. But on this the ex-president of the United States didn't say a word. He concentrates on the terrible conditions of the civilian populations in the occupied countries. In Warsaw, the child mortality rate is 10 times higher than the birth rate, and he called for an end to this Holocaust, the blockade being useless in any case, given that it wasn't able to halt the advance of the Wehrmacht. 624 It's apparent that Hoover is interested in discrediting the country or countries on whose side F.D. Roosevelt is prepared to intervene, and it should be said that it has been lost from memory this supposed Holocaust for which the champion of isolationism blamed London and in part Washington.